Good space time, y'all! In this special Citizen Cosmos episode, we talk to Deborah and Justin, the co-founders of Althea, a mesh network and a bandwidth marketplace. Justin and Deborah share their journey over the past several years, the ups, the downs, the good, the bad, and even the ugly. We discussed releasing software, common dev mistakes, working nights, the philosophy of building decentralized tools, and economic incentives.
It's 2010 and I figure out that Bitcoin exists and I start really reading how it works and I'm like, this is going to change the world.
Here, the beneficiaries are also the users.
General purpose computers exist and the world has not yet completely reconciled this fact.
That particular version of software connected about 25 people that provided them internet they did not have before.
And to build a future where the internet is something that we want to use.
In web3, how do you jump from being a startup to being a full-blown project that is working, ready, and you're up there already?
You're just always trying to do it.
Before we rock it off into our next episode, here is some news from our sponsor, Cyber. The Cyber Congress DAO is preparing the portal, which will open the gates of the rabbit hole. For now, the team invites everybody to create more cyberlinks using sib.ai. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Citizen Cosmos. And today we have a somewhat special episode. We have Deborah and Justin from Althea with us today. The episode today is just like a free-fall conversation about Althea and the journey the guys had over these several years already. I assume we will ask them that. They will tell us all about it. Deborah, please do. I mean, we had an episode with you already, but do you still guys want to introduce yourself? Say for all the listeners who you are, what you guys do.
Yeah, thanks. I think it might be good to give some context to the journey, right? So my name is Deborah Simpier. I'm CEO and co-founder of Althea. And circa 2016, 2017 had been crypto hobbyist, pre-Mount Gox, very involved. Actually, even before Bitcoin, I got involved in a thing called folding at home, right? So distributed compute power, always very believed in that. And then became a net neutrality activist, trying to move the needle from a political perspective. I also lived in a rural area where the internet was terrible. Money had gotten poured into this community and about $1 million for 1,500 people to build internet. But unfortunately, because the systems on the internet are like fundamentally flawed and broken, incentives are unaligned, the infrastructure was already built and then resold and sort of ended up in the same situation. So I was looking for solutions to this problem and also to protect the core freedoms of the internet when I met Justin.
Ta-da!
So Justin, if you could share perhaps a little bit of the context and then we can take it from the meeting of the minds there.
Yeah. So, hi, I'm Justin, CTO and co-founder of Althea. And for me, Althea existed in my head for a long time as sort of this calling, something that I really wanted to build. So for context, I was in early on in high school, and I was a real Linux nerd, building my own kernel, playing around with drivers, running any sort of open source software I could find. I just really loved playing around with computers. And the more I did it, the better I got at it and the more fun I had. And so it's 2010 and I figure out that Bitcoin exists and I start really reading how it works. And I'm like, this is going to change the world. This is crazy. And I was convinced, because if you're a Linux hobbyist and a computer hobbyist, you pretty quickly get into cryptography, which is, I think we could all go on for quite a while about how cool what you can do with cryptography is, sort of that idea of information as power really distilled. And the ability to do things, because that's what excites me about computing, is the ability to have an impact on the world, to make things better, to build something, a very traditional sort of engineering sense, go out with a hammer and make something new. So anyways, I was super excited about Bitcoin. And shortly after, I'm like, you could build a peer-to-peer bandwidth marketplace with mesh networking. And this was like sophomore year of high school. 2 or 3 months after I learned Bitcoin was a thing, I was already on this. I was like, this is cool. And I had read a good bit about mesh networking and I was interested in it and I saw a lot of possibility there, but I just didn't have the skills. And life goes on. I was a participant in the early Bitcoin community and all of that. So I go to college and I am working on my computer engineering degree. And I stick my head up because, Ethereum is coming out, a lot of stuff is going on. And I look into the crypto world again, and I'm like, surely somebody has to have built this. and I find no credible efforts. And I decide to try and make an attempt at designing it. This is HawkNet, which, as far as I know, is like the first real attempt anybody ever made for an incentivized crypto mesh network system. Oh no, this isn't 2017. This is like 2008 or 2009. God, it's been a long time. Anyways, I fail miserably because I'm a sophomore in college and I have no idea how to design anything. And I distinctly remember I was working on the economics of the design with my microeconomics professor, who was sort of vaguely interested in the idea. And he's like, well, I mean, why are you telling me about this? Shouldn't you go and patent it or something? And I'm like, no, I just want it to exist. Where is it? Just please exist. And so I finish my degree, I graduate, and I get my dream job doing performance engineering at Red Hat. And that was a really great opportunity and it was fun. And a couple of years into that, crypto is heating up again. So this time it is 2016, 17. And I take a look and I'm like, okay, surely somebody beat me to the punch here. Where are they? And this time I find a bunch of efforts, but all of them are not really credible. They're missing key elements. They don't really work. And so I decide, like, hey, I'm bored. I've wanted to do this thing for years. And the idea is sort of whispering in the back of my head every time. And I say, okay, I'm going to make an attempt. So I start printing out research papers on networking, cryptography, mesh networking, and I read 2 or 3 with breakfast. I read some with afternoon coffee. I read some in the evening. And I do this for months and months. And then I'm like, okay, I think I'm starting to get somewhere. I'm going to revive my old blog from that design attempt in college. And I'm going to just try and do this as a sort of a fun side project. And that was when I met our third co founder, Jahan, who had been working on something similar. And he had been reading my blog because, if you're looking for crypto mesh networks, that was it. The source material was the blog of some college sophomore who had no idea what he was doing. We got together and we put our heads together on a design and we started making more progress. We started to come up with something that was really practical and workable. And then I started implementing and really like writing the core networking protocol that we still use today. And we decided to go off and try and make it a startup. And this is where Deborah comes in. She had also been following what I had been doing and then what I and Jahan had been doing. And she reached out and said, I have a place where like we need this sort of software. There is no practical way to get good internet in my town without this sort of software. So I quit my job at Red Hat and I worked perhaps the hardest 3 weeks of my life to go from proof of concept to the very, very first version of Althea, which I boxed up and shipped to Deborah.
Router number 0. I still have it on my shelf.
Does it still work?
Yeah, it still works. It was an old Western Digital Netgear router. I think they retailed for like $20 at the time and scribbled on label. But, the rest, it was the beginning. It was the beginning of that history. And it actually, that particular version of software connected about 25 people that provided them internet they did not have before. So recruiting people to start with this crazy crypto mesh net in a little tiny town in Oregon was pretty fun too. It's like, hey, this is going to transform everything for you. You have to try this. This is super cool. But of course, like new software too, it was, it went through its ups and downs, and I definitely had to bring some gifts and wine and bake some bread and apologize for things not working for the first little bit.
How much bottles of wine did that cost you?
And that's the true early startup cost, right? You got to factor that into.
There we go. No, like jokes aside, but it's like the things, right? I mean, we have to do. But by the way, before we get into it, that's perfect context. But I do have one strange question for you. Did you find out about Bitcoin while you were still in high school or in college already?
Oh, no, I was in high school. I was running around telling everybody that this would change the world. I was selling old pairs of shoes on BitMEX. No, not BitMEX. It was BitKnit. It was some sort of eBay clone. I forget what it was called. And I was doing everything in my power. I was like, yeah.
That's so cool, like knowing about it in school. But did it change your perception? This is a strange question. I guess for the generation like from the 80s and the 90s. And I was talking about this to Eric Hen, but he didn't connect to this. I want to see if you do. I'm quite curious. For us, for example, like mobile phones or like smartphones are like part of our lives. And we don't think about it as something out of the ordinary. So I'm curious for people who found out about cryptocurrencies in high school. So it must be that for you, digital cryptocurrencies are not something that you need to think about. It's just like, boom, and it's in your head. Do you see what I'm trying to get at? Like, I don't know if it is like that for you. I'm trying to ask.
Yeah, so I think I constantly alternate between wondering why technology isn't better and between being in awe of what exists. So I'm a big computing history buff. I'm a big sci-fi buff. I was reading Cryptonomicon and then here comes crypto, like it actually happens. And I'm like, okay, wait a second, put the book down. What's going on here? So I think I should say that I see it as normal, but it still blows my mind. But really, the thing that I spend a lot of time thinking about is the enormous possibilities that are unexplored. There's a lot of work in cryptography and cryptocurrency that is flashy. It's like some new feature. It's like, okay, where they focus on doing something that's new, even if it's not necessarily super practical. And I'm just always walking around. I heard this particular line somewhere, so I can't take credit for it, but I think it's to the core of my point. General purpose computers exist, and the world has not yet completely reconciled this fact. Like the existence of computation on this scale is something that the world is not completely reconciled. There are still people updating spreadsheets by hand. They changed from doing paper to actual spreadsheets. So they only kind of know computers exist. They don't know that you don't need to update them by hand anymore. So the power in general purpose computing, the power in cryptography, and the sort of fundamental shifts it can drive in society and how we work together and connect as people, we're not even at the start yet. Cryptocurrency is kind of banging rocks together. I'm still waiting for the first social network to deeply embed peer to peer cryptography for the purpose of helping prevent spam, helping provide attestation that the content that you're viewing is real, for helping you to verify your day to day interactions with just anybody sending you a piece of paperwork. Stuff like this, like the really mundane stuff, is missing. And that's what's really powerful. And I think Deborah and I sort of share this bottom up perspective that infrastructure is what changes the world and new technology comes first. You have to get it out there.
I totally relate to every word you said there. I think that people have still not realized that there is a whole new elephant in the room called data management institution and how it affects our lives, how it works, how we live with it. Some people still think because they live on an island or I don't know, whatever, and they don't really use social networks, it doesn't affect their life. It does, guys. It does affect it. It goes, it's every day. And you're right, absolutely. People still update spreadsheets by hand. It's crazy how the world we live in. I mean, the future, we always kind of expect the future to come, but it's already here. You don't need to expect it. I mean, we read books and we think, oh, one day that will happen. No, it doesn't work like that. It's kind of this gradual things, And then somebody sent me a video yesterday from Moscow where a granny is walking a Yandex robot across the road because he couldn't, like, they tested some robots for delivery, and she took him by the hand and kind of walked him because she wasn't sure what he's doing there. So all fun and games, but it is like that to the point of, yeah, we're still not living there. Back to you guys. You said the context of the story. You send in this thing to Deborah. Deborah comes in. Deborah goes, buys a case of wine, convinces 25 people to work this thing. What happens later? How do you guys proceed from that point? Well, what's going on?
I think kind of the story about technology is a good backdrop for this, because I think part of the reason why Althea is successful is because the reasons why technology gets adopted is economic, right? And maybe that's some of the reason why we don't see it getting adopted more, right? You have to have an alignment of people that adopt that. And a lot of what we see in crypto is, and one of what we had to do is build the building blocks, right? So we always come in and say, look, technology is here, we've declared victory, everything works. But really, when you start actually getting into building, it's not the case. So we started building with payment channels. Jahan had some experience with that in the past, and we started to try to attack the problem like that, because that at the time was kind of the latest and greatest. It made a lot of sense. Justin, you can maybe give some context onto why that wasn't ultimately a winning solution. But I think that's a lot of part of our journey too, is like trying to build that, recognizing that we had to build all this underlying technology, and then ultimately pivoting from that. But Justin, I'll let you share a little bit of the reasons why that technology wasn't successful. Then we could talk about TCRs too, which we thought about doing for a little while too. I don't know if anybody in the new crypto world knows what a token curated registry is, but that was also hot at the time.
Before you Justin jump in, I remember about the payment channels. I remember Spunk Chain. And I remember there was a big team. They did actually a lot of work for the payment channels thing. And I remember it was 2016, I think. Sorry, Justin, go on. I'm going to let you take it from here. I just remembered for some reason. I don't know why.
Yeah. So Amin was also a supporter of Althea, and we had similar types of ideas about how and why that would work well, and encountered, I think, similar types of problems that Spunk Chain did too. So that was the era of payment channels.
In order to describe kind of the fundamental issue with the concept of payment channels as a scaling solution, you really have to get to the goal. If you have many people all wanting to pay one entity consistently, this works well. If you have a more distributed system like Althea, where one individual may want to pay 4 or 5 or 6 people, however, the network ends up being connected, you need to pay the router next to you for the bandwidth you're using. So that means you need to open a channel with each of them or have a channel hub. And then if you have a channel hub, you have to manage the hub, make sure that it's trustless, make sure that it can't do anything hostile. You also have to manage the various problems of dealing with the hub. And after a certain point, you're realizing you're solving many similar problems, like you're building some of the same tools as a proof of stake system. And you eventually just start saying, okay, we should maybe just put this on a more efficient L1. So this is how we sort of ended up moving away from payment channels because we put a lot of effort into the design. Jahan wrote what to this day is like the most efficient payment channel implementation that I know of in terms of Ethereum gas. But we could just never get over the management. Like, how do we manage the payment channels? How do we manage the hub? How do we make sure that we're not spending more money than we're saving? And eventually we were all getting together at a little Althea meetup. And I turn to Jahan and Deborah and I say, I think we can skip the payment channels for now. Because I had run the numbers on the gas prices. And I'm like, we can do this. It'll be a little painful, but we can do it. So we set aside payment channels. And as we moved on and worked on the billing implementation, which, by the way, had a million other complexities that showed up that nobody expected, I think I ended up getting the actual payments working after months and months of work by our team to do random things. Like there was no Ethereum libraries that could build transactions on the MIPS CPU architecture, which was most of the routers that we were programming. So we had to write our own Ethereum transaction generation library. Finally, I think it was over Christmas, everybody was taking time off and I was visiting my family and I would wake up and work 4 to 6 hours every morning from like 5 a.m. to maybe 11. And over the course of 2 or 3 weeks, I got the first payment implementation working. Working means it works once. There's a big difference between something that works once and something that never breaks. And so over the next 2 years, I would just be always looking at things. I get a report like, oh, there's this issue. This person paid too much. This person paid too little. And I go and I'd look at it and be like, oh, yeah, there's an issue. And I'd put in a patch. And then slowly incidents started to become like, oh, no, things are working correctly. And then the number of times I found a bug kept going down until finally I realized that I had gone 6 months without finding a bug. And it was finally stable and working. I guess this is where we can stop and merge back into the token curated registry scheme. Because on one side, there's me trying to build something that I wanted to build since I was very young and hyper focused on like, I want the product to work. I don't care about any of this other stuff. Why is it all here? Go away. I just wanted it to exist and I wanted it to be sitting on my desk, which sometimes still amazes me. This thing that I dreamed of for so long is finally just, well, here it is. It's not perfect. It's not absolutely perfect, but it works and it does everything that we wanted it to do and needed it to do. But in the process of getting there, I think I'll hand this off to Deborah.
I wanted to say it not only just works, but it's providing internet for networks in 6 states. We worked on deploying networks in Africa. This provides internet for businesses and fire stations and emergency management and homes all over the country. So part of the complexity here that Justin kind of is abstracting over a bit is that people expect internet to work 99.9% of the time. So
100.
Right. So not only did we have to develop this product that was completely new, we have to reinvent how we look at like a routing protocol. We have to look at a different way of metering and paying. So we did this all on XDAI. So there were not a lot of wallet software, things like that. We had to look at payment rails. Like all of these things had to be built and had to also be built and had to also be managed from a perspective of onboarding real people to crypto. your grandma, the local fire chief, all of these folks had to be able to use this, right? So it made for a really sort of complex, but also really exciting and rewarding time. Having someone have internet where they did not have it before and have that being enabled through a completely new system, or to see the payments working and providing a much better and aligned system was incredibly rewarding, but also super complex.
This is actually the next question I have. You guys have just told me about a crazy story where there's complexities developing, going from one solution from another solution. And I imagine that's not even half of it. I imagine that's the main things you remember. There are probably more. How does somebody who's developing software, how do you know when is the time that the software is developed? When you need to stop like trying to knock on that door that is not open anymore, like with the payment channels? I assumed that it was not what you guys wanted, right? And to look somewhere else. Is the end kind of goal is to say to yourself, if it works, then I should stop and that's our first product? Or should you always strive until it's perfect and solve every single bug, blah 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 blah? If it crashes, it's not perfect. Or should you release the first time it works? I mean, I don't know, like, how does a team know when is the right time to kind of come together and say, okay, here's our first release, here's our first product, let's try and ship it, let's try test it? Is there any difference between the old world and the web3, or is it still the same thing?
I wanted to say that I think that Althea has always been solving a problem. We developed this software because it needed to exist to solve a very fundamental problem. And so we knew that it was ready to be a prototype when people could use it, right? And it like very viscerally solved that problem. And then we could build on from there. And I think that's one of the unique properties of this team is that we interact with regular people using our product on a day-to-day basis. We have a deployment team and a development team. They talk, they interact. They're always thinking about meeting the needs of that user.
Yeah, so I'm going to come at this from a much more sort of a programmer angle. And that is that first and foremost, take a look at your design from the fundamentals up. Figure out how your actual system works. If you're coding on Web3 and you have never seen any Ethereum, any like EVM bytecode, learn how to read some basic EVM bytecode. Learn what a transaction actually does. Learn what's going on from the bottom up. And then carefully think about your design. Read what other people have done. Figure out what worked. Figure out what didn't work. Don't take anything for granted and do your research. And this is how you make good foundational decisions. But above all, once you have done your research and you're thinking about the problem and you are putting your metaphorical pen to paper, you want to run headlong into reality as fast as you can. And if that's a brick wall, you want to run right into that brick wall, full speed. No, there's no need to hesitate. Because if your project doesn't have a relationship with reality, is what I like to call it. People often end up working with a relationship to reality. Their product, they're designing a feature where, yes, this is great. It's easy. It works wonderfully. It's really complicated to design, but we have the skill to do it. But yes, it costs $500 per use and our customers don't have that much money. It's like, well, wait, hang on. Where is your relationship with reality? And this is why you have to try and ship quickly. That first version of Althea, you asked if it still works. And it does, because it was pretty much nothing. It was like 5 components. It was the very base foundation. I had taken everything and the kitchen sink and threw it out the door. And then we updated from there. And a lot of people would have said, well, updating is hard. You shouldn't have spent the time to ship a product that had no payments, had no automatic setup, had no ability for the router to do anything except exactly as it was configured on my desk. There was no installation routine. It was a very manual script. But it provided us with lessons. It got things working and it provided us with an environment to iterate with. It provided us with some place to put our software where it would either work or explode. And that is what you need. That's your relationship with reality. So first of all, spend a lot of time in your design and then figure out how you can fail. Because if you can't create a test that you can fail, then your project, your product, what you're building is not close enough to reality to bother with. You'll never know.
Yeah, I think the other thing, you have to also understand traction, right? Are you building something that is going to get adopted, is going to get used, right? So if you don't ever get anything out there, you can't begin to understand how your user is going to interact with it.
There was an anecdotal story. I'm not sure to how true that is, but I used to be in the Israeli Air Force many years ago, and there was a story: why does Israel doesn't build their own planes? Well, they do. Apparently, they did build one, but the reality was it was so expensive. It was so full of features that it could never be implemented. That they had to use planes for that to buy from the States, from NATO, whatever. But it's very true. Because I have also like built several products in Web3, so I'm kind of like trying to come from the places where I failed and ask you. So that's my kind of game, to be honest. Now, how does one understand, especially like in crypto and Web3, how does one understand a team that the product is not ready to be shipped, but it came out of the beta stage or the alpha stage? Like a lot of users, when they go on applications, especially, you have like this beta on top. And sir, when does beta stop? When is the next step? Like a lot of people ask, when do we stop the beta? When do we stop the alpha? When is the real thing going to be released? Like, and in crypto, it's really popular to do, like especially Bitcoin, we still see what software 0 points and dot point something. It's been around for what, like 12 years now, right? But we're still there. In Web3, how do you jump from being a startup to being a full blown project that is working, ready, and you're up there already?
You're just always trying to do it. And then one day you realize that you've done it.
Great answer.
I think that a startup is a series of pivots that get smaller and smaller and smaller as you narrow in on what works, right? So when we started, we built a lot in fixed wireless radios that were inexpensive, that let us iterate quickly. And then the landscape changed as it does and it evolves. And now our primary focus is on fiber optic cables and on LTE and 5G and 4G kind of infrastructure, right? And then, of course, we had to build the gravity bridge, right? And iterating on that and that concept. And that's, been changing. But if you don't keep that mentality of continuing to iterate, to evolve along with the landscape, certainly in crypto, it's an exceedingly evolving landscape. So whether you call it a startup or a finished profitable company might be the delineation between where you are fully profitable. But I think even in a fully profitable company, if you are not evolving, you're either growing or you're dying. There's no in between.
I guess where I was like kind of heading to was more in the normal world, let's call it like that. You kind of like a single beneficiary or there's 5 beneficiaries, whatever. When it's kind of obvious, when we are all getting money, that means it's working, right? Kind of thing. We have customers, we have money. Here, the beneficiaries are also the users, which is very different from what it was like before. And now you're not the beneficiary and you're not building a centralized thing, you're building a decentralized thing. So when is it something decentralized is finished? As the kind of question, I guess never. Justin kind of was like, you just do it, right? Well, I guess you just go ahead and build it. That's what I was trying to imagine in my head.
Yeah, in some ways, sometimes crypto is a bit divorced from the yield of whatever that they're building. And that can create, what we see oftentimes is the value of the underlying asset is not necessarily correspond to the yield, right? And that creates a little bit of a precarious situation. So I think what you're trying to do always is get to where your underlying yield and utility of the blockchain matches the value of your asset.
Justin, did you want to add something?
Yeah, we've been talking a lot about the difficulties of building a product and getting users. And I think having users want to use our product. And I think that is what is often missed in like Web3 is that you have 2 sets of users. You have token holders and you have an actual user of the product. And you need to be very careful to try and bring these people as close together or to pay attention to them separately. And this has been one of the big issues in Althea, and this is in large part my fault, is that we focused excessively on figuring out how to build the product. And we actually got the product built, which is ridiculous. You think about all the different things you need to reinvent to like say, yes, we're going to reconsider how the internet service provider system works from the ground up. We're going to build our own operating system. Oh yeah, we have to make Ethereum transactions too. Oh yeah, we got to do all of this mesh networking stuff too. Okay, sure, we can do all that. It's crazy. But, the other side of Althea, the sort of question of what does now the Althea blockchain look like that started with the token curated registry and other things like that, that was not treated as seriously for a long time. And you have to keep these things in balance. And I think that's a mistake we made early on that Althea was bankrupt for a short period, but we stuck through it. And because our software worked, because our networks were actually profitable, we didn't have to shut down operations. We could keep the homes we had installed. But it was a very tight, 8 months?
Yeah, this was just to add a little bit of context. Yeah, we had essentially looked at, building in payment channels that got us a little behind. And then we looked at like, okay, well, how do we build this blockchain that's going to be useful? And the idea of kind of a token curated registry where people would vote on the validity of the network and these kinds of things would perhaps be a good fit for a token model. But also as, that's kind of was a short-lived phenomenon. And then our third co-founder Johan Trimbeck stepped down to pursue other things. So it was January 2020. I stepped up into CEO. We didn't have any money. And we had to sort of reinvent ourselves, which I think blockchain is a great place to do that in, right? And a lot of the reason too we were behind is because in order to settle directly onto an Althea blockchain, we needed this fundamental bridge, which before we came along was being worked on in Cosmos under a product name called Peggy, but was very behind in the deliverables. It wasn't coming to fruition. So that's when we started to kind of come in. It was one of those decisions, well, if you need something built, sometimes you just have to build it yourself.
Do it yourself, yeah. Yeah.
Right. But that, I think, got us back onto a really solid trajectory. And we were able then to also, in parallel, as Justin said, deliver the product, focus on growing the networks and on that traction and iterating on the product itself, while building toward the future of the Althea blockchain and what needed to be built out. But Gravity was a monumental undertaking too, which I think it's been 2 years now. So it's 2020 when we started that. It's now 2022. And Gravity Bridge launched December of 2021. What was really cool, right? So what Gravity sort of evolved into is this really amazing decentralized validator set. We started off decentralized. Justin can share more about that too. But now we have lots of other projects that are part of it, of Condex and Checked and Persistence and Stargaze, and all these other different projects are coalescing around this core piece of infrastructure that's now in the world. So it's really exciting to see that come to fruition, and looking forward now to where we're at with the Althea blockchain launch in a couple of months. But I don't know, Justin, if you want to talk about the Gravity Bridge some.
So it's a couple of years ago, and Deborah says to me, hey, we're going to need a bridge because customers absolutely demand stablecoins. And if we want it to work really well, you're going to have to build it. And I'm like, you're right. But no, please no.
Yeah, the core logic. Well, we got to build it. Justin's the guy for the job.
Yeah. So after a little bit of arguing back and forth, things worked out the way they always do, which is that Deborah says, Justin, I need something really big and I need it like 2 days ago. I'm like, okay, no. And then, a week or two later, okay, I'll get serious about this. So, Gravity Bridge is a bridge between Cosmos SDK-based chains and EVM-based chains. And I always came at this as like, how do I simplify? Because I had just come out of building Althea, and I knew everything that can go wrong goes wrong, and then it goes wrong again, and then it goes wrong again, and then it goes wrong again. And then maybe a year later, it stops going wrong. So complicated products are hard. And I came in with a philosophy of, okay, I want to build a really seriously decentralized bridge, and it needs to be as radically simple as we can. This is something we went through the entire design and development process with a focus on avoiding flashy decisions. It doesn't have spinning rims, but it's very efficient. It's very decentralized. It's the only cross-blockchain bridge that I'm currently aware of that is not upgradable. All of these other bridges, they come in, they say they're decentralized, they say they're secured by these validator sets. And they're like, oh yeah, the team has a 2-person multi-sig that can update the Solidity contract at any time and take all the funds. I'm just like, once again, where's your relationship with reality? And the answer is that they're focusing on one side of their user base. They're focusing on providing a bridge because that's what a bridge that works, that makes token holders happy, but not the actual bridge users. The actual bridge users think they're using something decentralized, and that's not okay. I don't think that's ethical, the way many of these bridges are presented.
One thing I want to say here too is like oftentimes we hear these things and we call them hacks, right? But really it's just an ill-advised like 2-person multi-sig or 3-person multi-sig, right?
Multi-sig of respected people, yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's mischaracterized a lot of times. I think it's also what Justin is highlighting is really there's just not a lot of transparency into the security.
Yeah. You'll have a bridge that says they're decentralized and they have an update multi-sig of a couple of people, and they're the only ones that can run the relayer. So you're saying, well, okay, I don't see any decentralization here. And this is where we put a lot of our effort in Gravity Bridge, is to try and make it decentralized. We started with over 100 validators in control of the Gravity Bridge contract from block 0. So we did an enormous decentralized start with more than 100 validators, and every single one of them is in the light client update that goes to Gravity Bridge. And this provides security that is as close as possible and is, in fact, pretty much a direct mirror of the basic IBC security properties. But we can't do some of the more advanced IBC security features, But at a basic level, Gravity Bridge is as close to IBC as you can get practically on Ethereum. And this was really our goal, is to make something that it's not a generic message passing system. It doesn't have like a million features. We don't support multiple EVM chains yet, but Gravity Bridge is actually decentralized. And despite that, is cheaper to operate than some of these 10-person multi-sig bridges. We have 150, 140 validators that are submitting signatures. It is cheaper to execute than a bridge with only 10 people in it, because we focus so much on taking things out. Simplicity, simplicity, simplicity. Gravity.sol, the Ethereum contract, it had to be so small, we knew we would never need to upgrade it. And that's crazy. How do you make sure you get it right the first time and say, okay, well, we're going to once and done this? And the answer is, it's less than 700 lines. You can go and read the whole thing in the next 5-10 minutes. And that is how you know you got it. And that's how you make it small enough that it's possible that you know you got it right.
While we're on the topic of Gravity Bridge, I'm going to have two questions. One is for everybody who's listening to this and all the listeners who potentially want to become validators of Gravity Bridge. How do they proceed? Do they just go and it's all decentralized, free, no, I presume, no whitelist, none of this, submit your 27 KYC documents, your dog's name, your dog's paws, prints, whatever, right? So that's the first question for everybody who's listening. So guys, if you want to participate in web3 and being part of that infrastructure, and we're personally going to be looking at it as well in Citizen Cosmos.
Okay, for the first question, A, we would love if people would submit pictures of their dogs, because we love dog pictures. B, if you want to join the Gravity Bridge validator set or relay messages to and from Ethereum, you go to github.com, Gravity Bridge, Gravity-Bridge, Gravity-Docs. And that's the GitHub repo containing the documentation. You don't need to ask anybody for anything else. Oh, I mean, we'll be happy to help. But there are no whitelists. Once you're a validator, your Ethereum key will be updated into the bridge automatically. I'm not going to get into the gas optimizations there, although they're really cool. Anyways, I spent a lot of time over the past few years thinking about gas optimizations.
We also have a great Discord too. So for folks kind of looking to jump in or ask questions, there's a good community there that can be helpful to that process.
And the second question, since you have built the first decentralized bridge, if the technology, the cryptography and everything else, in theory, allows for what you have in your head, what would, right now, in your opinion, the perfect decentralized bridge between two different networks? How would it look like? What would it seem like?
First of all, I will correct that. Most bridges to and from Ethereum are fairly heavily centralized because Ethereum is really hard. IBC is a truly decentralized bridge, and it beat out Gravity's release by quite some time. So they get that crown, and I want to make sure credit is given where it is due. So the future of bridges. I think a lot of this comes down. So I have probably a radically different perspective on this. You know, if you ask this question, you could say that zero knowledge proofs are really incredibly cool, and they are. You could say that everything is going to use IBC, which is also probably the right direction to go in the future. But my concern is about fundamental tooling, something that's really, really boring. I think that the future of bridging and the future of blockchains is first and foremost improved tooling around syncing nodes. It is so hard to get a fully synced node to just relay an IBC proof because the tooling is not nearly as good as it could be. We could have Cosmos nodes, Ethereum nodes that sync 5-10 times faster. We could have them use any amount of disk space you want and have enormous data availability. It is possible in terms of software to make Infura obsolete in probably less money than almost any Web3 project spends. The lack of fundamental attention to tooling is really what's holding back a lot of Web3, in my opinion, is that everybody wants to work on the next zero knowledge proof. But when they go to build this proof, they're like, oh yeah, we need to sync a full node. That's going to take a week. Okay, everybody, go take a break. And I'm just like, what? Once again, where's your relationship with reality? Because you have this incredibly complicated match that people are trying to do with incredible capabilities. And they're like, oh yeah, we need to get the source data. We're just going to sync every block in order. And we're just going to need to have enough disk space for all of them, guys. And we're going to write them all to the disk one after the other and use a bunch of extra disk IO. And this all sounds like a great idea to us. And once again, this comes back to what Deborah was talking about, is that what technology is capable of and what actually happens is based on economic incentives. And right now, we're still really missing the economic incentives in the Web3 space to dramatically improve the boring foundational tooling. And this is something I think a lot about for Althea. Because Althea, if we want it to be the way internet is bought and sold, it needs to be reliable. And when I say reliable, I don't mean, yes, it works sometimes. I mean reliable in the sense of, no, it will never break. And these are the sorts of problems that I think about, like, okay, what's going to cause the chain to fail? And what are the really hard problems around keeping things moving, keeping transactions moving, and all of this? And there's just so much inefficiency at these lower levels that everybody above is just sort of putting up with. And I think that is really the next step. Because once I can start up an IBC relayer, have it sync 10 blockchains in a matter of 15 minutes, and then start submitting proofs across all of them seamlessly, that will be when we are ready for the next stage of bridging.
I understand what you mean, because half of the things you said are like life stories. Oh, I'm just sending you some files over IPFS because it's decentralized. No worries that it's about a terabyte. You'll get it eventually, and like all those things are like, oh my God, this is like dragging and dragging. I totally understand what you're saying.
I think what Justin is saying is like very like viscerally relatable to all of us.
It's a pain. It's a pain. It feels right here. Yeah, I can feel it.
We all feel that. I was going to say, I think that there's some interesting things, especially in Cosmos, as many of the validator sets are the same or there's interconnection, right? You're seeing the evolution of things like liquid staking and interchain security and interchain accounts that really sort of blend the security, the underlying security, staking and rewards between blockchains. And I think I see that evolution coming in the near future, and how those things can interact and work together and secure blockchains, I think is really fascinating. So I think we'll see a lot of space evolve.
A couple of questions. So one, if you had now, I mean, and you have like said million things already, to be honest, both you and Justin, but still, if you had now to pick, let's say 2 or 3 pieces of advice, not just do, but also really don't do that for somebody who is going to be building, especially specifically somebody who's out there. And I know there's a lot of teams, especially in stealth mode now, building IBC, which is, I'm not sure how correct that is, but I'm not going to go that way. Stealth, not stealth. Let's people do whatever they want. Decentralization, that's the beauty of it. But anyways, your piece of kind of advice, whether it's do or don't, for people who are building not necessarily an IBC based chain, but let's stick to that, or maybe a chain that is going to be cross EVM IBC. What would you say to those teams right now?
My perspective is always a bit more toward the business and practical side of it. So we do see a lot of projects come in, build great technology, but lack the underlying, business fundamentals. And then oftentimes what happens is another chain will come along and iterate on that, be much better at biz dev marketing. So my suggestion is to make sure that you're aligned with your user, that your product solves a problem, and that you're focused on the business and economic access. Kind of just to loop back to our early part of the conversation, real change happens because of the incentives being aligned, right? And that's very fundamental in blockchain, right? Because your user and your provider are aligned in how that works, right? So if you miss that step, if you build amazing technology but don't necessarily align those incentives, that change won't evolve and come.
And I think my advice from a technical perspective is everything, all of our tools, all of our programming languages, environments, systems are designed for building up, for putting more code on top. And the answer is you need to look down. You need to say, what is under me that is causing me issues? And don't be afraid. A lot of people will say, I can't afford to dig into that. I've got to get something done quicker. So we're going to take this shortcut. That's fine. You do have to do some of that. You can't build everything to be perfect. But you have to be willing to say, like, okay, this is really causing issues for me. And I am going to do a deep dive and try to do something that's very technical, that's very hard, that I don't think I should have to do. Somebody should provide me a library that works. I shouldn't have to make my own. But you should try it. Be willing to understand what is under you and be willing to go down there and monkey with it. Because if you don't, you'll find yourself building all sorts of weird structures to get around stuff. And eventually that'll all collapse down on you and you'll wonder, like, man, it's been a month and I still can't ship a working build of my product. And the answer normally is that you need to look at what's under your product and say, something wrong here.
Totally. I think like getting your hands dirty is something that a lot of people should be ready to do. I mean, if they, I think any business, right? I guess the last like resume question, more a little bit about Althea, like especially for all the Althea listeners out there, like what are you guys, now that you guys have more or less kind of like, whew, okay, we have a product, we have a project, it's working. Like Justin said, but don't have to solve a bug every 5 minutes anymore. It's only now the time between the bugs is growing. Well, hopefully. What is the goals now in front of Althea? I don't mean like the whole thing, but just like in a couple of words, what you can share, of course, especially something that is related to the future development of Althea as a project and growing as a community project, whatever, company, whatever. What's the right word here? I get lost sometimes with Web3.
Yeah, I think what's exciting about Althea is the blockchain is very imminent, right? And then when you have that core open source layer of protocol and blockchain, it invites many different people to build on it for their use case, right? So that might look different for, let's say, Africa versus something in the US, right? Where we'll focus on fiber and LTE. So seeing that evolution come from being kind of our core efforts and then expanding that out, I think is really exciting. Another thing that we're hearing from telecom and carriers that we're going to be building for is that having markets for these larger scale assets like, fiber optic cable or RF spectrum, and having that be tokenized and opening that market up is also an expanding space that we can support on the Althea blockchain. So I think, as Justin said earlier, a lot of times I'll be like, well, we need this, we got to build this, you're the right guy for the job. So I think there is, once the Althea blockchain is out, we're going to be moving on to the next thing to basically solve those pain points in the internet as it is now.
We're finally at the point where Althea is ready to be used sort of the way we envisioned it, with many people, many networks working together and sort of changing the way that internet service is bought and sold. And this is crazy ambitious. You're like, what's our goal? It's like, oh, change the way the internet is bought and sold. But it's what needs to happen to make things more equitable, more distributed, and to build a future where the internet is something that we want to use and not something that is something out of our worst net neutrality nightmares.
Do you guys want to add anything else that I didn't ask or that you wanted to share or to say, guys, I don't know, whatever?
Yeah, I think the only thing that I want to add is thank you and appreciation to the amazing community in Cosmos. The Interchain Foundation works very hard, as well as all these kind of core entities like Peggy JV, Tendermint to support. Informal does a lot of work supporting that kind of underlying infrastructure. And the validator community is amazing. That's what makes Gravity Bridge able to be so successful. And so wanted to just give a shout out to all those folks who, working hard every day behind the scenes, can be sometimes unglamorous, but that's what enables the decentralized future.
Guys, thank you so much for finding the time to share all this advice and to share your story. It's been amazing. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.